Welcome back to the Sigil stream. My name is always Mr. Harlan Guthrie, and I'm here once again with the lovely and talented Ms. Jo Fallick. How you doing, Jo?
Good afternoon. I'm doing so well.
Good
How are
afternoon
you?
to you. How are you doing today?
Great, and triple great. Let's go with triple great.
Triple great. That's great. Hope everyone out there is having an equally great day. It is, of course, Friday, so it's almost the weekend, which means that, you get to do something you like. Typically, that's how weekends go. You get to settle down, put your feet up, read a few books or comic books or graphic novels. Here's a question for you, Jo. Do you think graphic novels are the equivalent of like reading a book?
Yeah, absolutely. They totally count. I have one right here, actually.
That's not a graphic novel. That's a comic.
That's
Where's
a graphic...
my boo sound effect?
Excuse me. Would you not call this a graphic novel? I guess it's a graphic short story. A novel, I guess, assumes a longer format, right?
Yeah, well, that's the question. What's more exciting, right? Like a graphic novel, a graphic comic?
I'm of the opinion that all written word should be treated equally.
All written word, eh? Even
instruction pamphlets.
Fan fiction? My hair is doing things today. It's not really paying along. I don't know. I feel like, especially with some of the more lengthy graphic novels and stuff like that. Like I was reading one the other day by Alan Moore, Providence, a Lovecraftian one, which is awesome. And there's pages and pages of like writing in it, just shots of someone's diary. And I feel like I was reading a book. So I felt good about that. Though the perceived notion of consuming a particular type of media being better than others is sort of...
I'm not snobby about it. If you want to read young adult novels, if you want to read a book of high literature, poetry...
Or a book of haikus.
Or if you want to read like a Dungeon Master's Guide, I feel like they're all of a kind.
Good segue into our topic today. So as you know, here on Sigil Spotlight, we typically have a guest on, which we interview, we chat about a number of different things, their work, their role here in Sigil. Today's episode is part of a new segment. We're going to be doing these every once in a while when we have a number of questions from the community, such as yourself, that we want to help and sort of give tips to and all that kind of stuff. And we're really excited to sort of talk about the tips and tricks, as we've called it for today, episode 1.
Premiere of a new segment.
Yeah,
a whole new segment.
This isn't the first time we've done this, luckily. So today we're going to be talking about a number of topics, primarily from the DM or a GM perspective, but we're also going to be talking about stuff from a player perspective as well. And we're going to be dealing with 4 subjects. We're going to be dealing with game prep, RPG etiquette, creating memorable NPCs or non-player characters, and developing a campaign. And we're going to briefly touch on most of these. We're not going to be here for an absorbent amount of time. And if we sort of don't get through all the topics, we'll push them on to the next episode of Tips and Tricks. But more than likely, we're going to be back next episode with an interview again, to splice these in for those educational types, because ultimately I think we're all still growing. We're all still understanding the world of RPGs. And Jo and I both have a great number of years now of experience in running, creating, crafting, playing RPGs in many different ways. So that being said, we are by no means experts. These are some things that we've been practicing for many, many years. And to give you a bit of a background, we've been running a community RPG live stream channel for the past 7 years now, I think, where every Wednesday we run an RPG, and we played a plethora of systems, whether it be the Cypher system or Numenera or the Strange or the Alien RPG or Call of Cthulhu or Trial of Cthulhu or End of the World or Roll for Shoes or Everyone is John or Dungeons and Dragons or Shadowrun, I believe we've done too, as well as Deadlands and a genuine plethora of games. Again, not to say that it makes us experts, but we're definitely used to the ideas that are going to be presented today and giving you some advice. And I don't think anybody that dungeon masters or plays only takes one piece of advice anyway. So we're always looking to sponge. Am I wrong?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, you can always get better at the thing that you love to do. Put it that way, just by practicing.
Sir Guy already has a question, which is fantastic. We're going to push that a little bit to the ending. And if, in the meantime, if you can expand on exactly what you mean by that, because I think that's a great question. And I want to know exactly what you mean with that. But so yeah, let's start off again. This is a little bit out of the norm for Sigil Spotlight, but we're going to jump right into it with question one, or number one topic for today: tips and tricks, game prep.
Game prep.
Game prep.
It is, if you are the dungeon master, and especially if you are a new dungeon master, probably one of the scariest times is getting ready for that first session. And for me, I would say, personally, one of the more important things about game prep is making sure that you understand at least the bare nuts and bolts of how the system works.
Absolutely.
Harlan may disagree. He is, on our streaming channel, a fan of running a game that may have very few roles, maybe no system at all. But that's not to say that that's not an RPG. Harlan has considered the rules in his own brain.
I think a broader way to sort of address this first is, are you a first-time DM or a classic DM?
Yes.
Like, have you done it a number of times? So starting with those two types, if you are a first-time DM, Joe, what you're saying about the rules is important if you are sitting down at a table that is expecting to either understand the rules or play the game as written, or rules as written, or raw, as the what do you call that?
It's an acronym.
An acronym. Thank you. So if you are a first-time GM sitting down at a table, rules as written, Joe, walk us through that experience, or some examples of game prep that you want to consider.
I mean, people say read the player's handbook in whatever format that might come in, front to back, which I think is really kind of unnecessary. You don't really need to know what all of the characters can do and how to build characters unless you need to walk people through that. So if this is your first time running a game and you are just interested in getting some people down at the table and having some fun, it's their job to figure out how their character works.
Yeah.
That's my opinion.
Absolutely. Making that clear to your players is key. And I think game prep, the golden rule we're going to talk about with game prep today is communication with the players. And because this is pre-sitting down at the table, game prep is everything you're getting ready before you sit down and roll that first die and write that first what's it. And so many of the issues that might come up can be solved by really great communication, by putting your standards forward. So again, if you're a new DM or GM, and again, that's Dungeon Master or Game Master, there's many different titles for different systems. I think Call of Cthulhu's Keeper.
I heard someone call it a game facilitator, which I thought was really cool because it didn't require the person running the game to have like more prestige than anyone else. Kind of like I'm making the game happen.
But you know, it's interesting because I think there are certain systems, and again, this is a conversation that you'd have with the players. There are certain systems where a game facilitator is more appropriate. And I think there are more systems where a game master is more appropriate. And we're going to talk about a little bit more of that in RPG etiquette, because I think that's one of the most important rules, understanding the GM or DM's role in the game you're playing. But game prep starts with talking to your players, asking them questions. Hey guys, welcome. Is this your first game? Is this your 150th game? You know, what kind of information you want to gather from them? If it's a rules as written game, if you are following the player's handbook or the rule book of whatever system you might be doing, are they going to take the responsibility on them to learn the player's roles, or are they expecting you to sort of carry it? And this comes down to what kind of game you're preparing for. Is it a convention? Is it around the table? You know, or are you playing with first-time characters? You know, if you're at a convention or if you're playing with people for the first time, then absolutely, as Joe mentioned, you want to be the one to walk them through character creation. So game prep, in essence, is about communication. It's about talking to the people that are at your table, or having them understand exactly what you are bringing to that. Because certain cases, you're at a convention, you might not get to have a back and forth, in which case you need to communicate in a very clear manner what you expect from them when you sit down at that table.
This goes right into a conversation about tone. When
Mhm.
you're prepping for a game, understand what kind of a tone of a game you intend to deliver to your players and communicate that with them prior to the game session in some way, just so that everyone can be on the same page. There's nothing worse than sitting down at the table with your notes out and you have built all this lore and
Yeah.
you've got all your maps out, and the 4 other people who are sitting across from you just want to have a couple of beers and joke around and roll some dice and have a good time, and they're not really going to be into note taking, right? You're setting
Yeah.
yourself up for conflict there. So
well, yeah, exactly. And you're setting yourself up for failure and disappointment on everybody,
Mhm.
which goes back to that communication. If you say, hey, ladies and gentlemen, when we're playing a game next week, it's going to be light, it's going to be funny, you're not going to need to know the rules. All I want you to do is show up with a blank character sheet or a filled out character sheet and have some fun. It also gives space for the players to sort of explain that they're not in the mood for that, or say that, they're not really feeling that, or ask, could we be more serious about things like that? Tone is one of the second most important conversations that you can have following the general what you're expecting in the game.
Mhm.
Beyond that, we have a great question from Sir Guy, which might as well answer right now. How would you streamline introducing new players to the game? Dungeons and Dragons has more rules than a computer manual and can overwhelm new players. What's your fastest way to get on? Joe, why don't you, and then I'll.
I mean, that's a great question. I would say, first of all, either sit them right beside you or get them buddied up with someone who loves the game and who you know is going to be a great um, coach, I suppose. Um, Pre-print a character sheet. There's nothing more frustrating for a brand new player than being sat down with the player's handbook and trying to figure out, what the hell am I doing? So bring some pre-generated sheets with them, and don't be afraid to muck it up with some highlighter or whatever. Highlight the salient parts of whatever on the character sheet is important for whatever game system you're playing, right?
Mhm.
Whether that's going to be like, here's your AC, explain what armor class is, here's your HP or whatever. But more importantly, I think, let them know that beyond the rules, that this is a game, like if we're talking about brand new people to the whole idea of RPGs, this is a game about having fun with each other, about make believe, about just kind of set out what exactly role playing is for them first, so that they know this isn't just a board game. Like, the opportunities are kind of endless as long as you're respecting everyone's boundaries at the table, and you're playing in good faith. You can kind of make any potential decision that you want. Like, introduce it to them as if it's acting with each other, like an improv scene, but with dice rolls to interpret whatever circumstances would be governed by chance, I suppose. And then, as they have questions, as it comes up in the course of playing, you can have an aside where you explain a specific rule, or the person who's sitting beside them can sort of take them aside and be like, see, here is how you're gonna roll this dice. This is a D8 or whatever. Just try to make it as seamless and easy to pick up as they go along as possible.
Yeah, for me, I'm a big believer in jumping in without overloading. I think Joe and I are two different types, which is why I think we have at times different views about how to, run a game and things like that. Like, I am somebody who's very dumb when it comes to rules, when it comes to understanding from a DM and a player perspective.
You have different priorities.
I have much different priorities. So my way of teaching or onboarding someone to the rules is much more along the line of offer them a number of pre-gens. So if I was running D&D, I would have a few pre-gens. I'd be like, cool, do you want to be like an elf ranger or whatever? Most of the time, people are kind of like, I don't know. What does that mean? I don't understand. And my explaining way is very much in lines of using media. I'll be like, cool, well, this is like a Legolas. This is like a Gandalf. Or if they haven't seen Lord of the Rings,
Then what are you doing at the table with
this
this
is like a
person?
Wheel of Time character. This is like a Han Solo, but instead of a gun, he uses a bow. This is like, because to me, onboarding in that way is the best. Because what you're telling is a movie in your brain. You're telling a novel. You're telling a story, something that's going to be bombastic and fun at moments. So I'll say, here's sort of an easy way, pick this character, and let's not worry too much about beyond that. I want you to get into the mindset of who you are. Like, pick your name. That's all you really have to do. I want to figure out who you are and your backstory.
Mm-hmm.
It's a shame because D&D isn't a game that benefits hugely on backstory, unlike a Call of Cthulhu or something like that, which is typically my onboarding game, because that's just more my jam, and I think it matters more for your backstory. But beyond that, I would then utilize the game to explain the rules. And this is the best part about being a DM, and I think a conversation I have with DMs or prospective DMs so much that it's almost funny that people forget it. Because oftentimes DM feel like they're wedged into a corner. They're like, oh, well, I want to introduce new players, but, the starting Assault March is so combat heavy. Or I want to start off new players, but Minds of Phandelver is sort of a slow adventure, and I don't really want them to get into combat right away. And all I respond to that is, you're the GM.
Mm-hmm.
You do whatever you want. If you want to do a mini game before the game starts to show them how lockpicking works, you do that. If Minds of Phandelver starts here on the road, but you don't feel comfortable with them jumping right into combat, start them back on the road. Start them picking their way out of a prison cart with no stakes. You are not beholden to anything. And I use tools like this to onboard players into the sort of themes of what the game entails in terms of the rolling, similarly to what Joe was saying. Whereas if I'm like, cool, so you're stuck in a cage, what do you do? And they're like, well, can I open the door? No, it's locked, but you can probably pick it. Okay, what does that mean? Well, on your sheet, you have something called lock picking. So roll a d20 and add that number. If you get above a number, kind of like that. And to me, that's the best way to do it. Sitting down at the table with a blank character sheet is so intimidating. I prefer to sort of retroactively introduce that. So they play a character for a session or two, and then you go back and then you're like, cool, you get this. Do you like the rogue? Blah, blah, blah. That other guy you're playing with, that's a paladin. Do you like that more? Blah, blah, blah. Let's swap it out. Maybe he changes the character or she changes the character at this point. Not a big deal. Or do you want to just mess around with your stats? Here's how we do point buy and all that kind of stuff. And bring it on them so much slower than I think most people.
Are you suggesting like starting the first session, maybe even with a new player who doesn't have a character sheet at all?
Not necessarily. I think a pre-gen, and then you kind of you can either change that pre-gen or build on it.
Because I could see a world where you'd be like, okay, this is your D20. Roll it. If you get a high number, that's great.
But the problem is that I think that sets you up for failure in a few different ways. I think if you're building a character that way, you're spending so much effort on either that one character or on the entire group's character creation that it kind of becomes more about that.
No, I'm sorry. I don't mean to create a character together.
Oh.
I mean, you start into the session. People who are familiar with the game have got their character sheets and stuff. The brand new person doesn't have to have a sheet at all. They can just figure out what it's like to play a role-playing game by acting and then rolling a dice and being like, high number, I got the thing.
Sure, yeah, you could do that way.
Without having to worry about like, what is the stat of my bow?
To me,
what is my skill points?
Yeah, you could do that. I wouldn't though. I think ultimately, even if they're not aware of exactly what's happening, having the numbers in front of you is the easiest way for them to associate and start building up, that connection. Like, okay, well, you add this to it, and then you're pointing at, okay, cool, I'm attacking. Where was it again? Okay, this thing. Rather than just being like, what am I adding to it?
Mm-hmm.
I think that sets you up for failure when eventually you do want them to have a character sheet because they're only learning about it from sort of that standpoint. But great question, Sir Guy. And I think, again, there's no wrong answers to how to do this. That's how I onboard people. Obviously, Joe onboards slightly different, but more of the same in terms of like having pre-gens and things like that. We also, Merlin made a wonderful comment here. It finds backstory can sometimes scare new players. Having to think about the history can be difficult. Explaining that can just be a loose scaffold they can build and can help. Absolutely. And the only reason I sort of tend to push backstory is because to me, backstory is the easiest way for non-roleplay thinkers to start role-playing. It's very difficult to be like, hey, here's a name, step into their shoes and be who they are. And backstory is like a way of prompting them. Be like, hey, but like, who are you? Like, how did you get here? And who are your parents? And da-da-da. And more than anything, to me, it's just a way to start walking in the shoes of the character you're playing. And for me, as a very role-play focused character, it starts bridging the gap between people who might be number crunching and people who might be actually living out someone else's life.
And if you have a new player who seems really uncomfortable and really put on the spot by questions about their character's backstory, it's okay for them to decide what the answers are throughout the course of the game,
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
It's not a census.
No. And we're going to talk about that in RPG etiquette as well, because ultimately there's a lot of respect that comes around the etiquette of it. But anyway, so you've picked your type of game. You know what kind of, whether you're a new or your old GM, this sort of is all going with the understanding that you're also picking a system. There are many different ways to play a role-playing game, some entirely without systems, but we're sort of going with the traditional method. So you've picked Pathfinder, you've picked Suede or D&D, and you are a first-time DM. You've communicated with your team. You've said, okay, guys, I'm a first-time DM. We're going to be running through an adventure. If it's a pre-made adventure, there's a conversation there. Please don't look up any information. If you want to have a secretive adventure, here's the handbook. If you guys want to track me along the way, don't know why you do that, but different strokes.
Different strokes.
Different strokes for different folks. Or I'm kind of taking you through my own written adventure, which is a great way to be creative. We're going to talk about that in developing a campaign in a second, and a little bit in RPG etiquette, because there are some things when you are playing your own words that you really don't want to do, and things that you do want to do. We'll talk about that in a second. Joe mentioned setting tone, vitally important. What are they going to experience, and what are you going to experience? And think about it in terms of marketing. Like when you go into the new Saw movie, you know what you're in for. You have a certain level of expectations. It's going to be horror. It's going to be scary. It's going to be gory. That's all tone setting is. It's not content warnings. That's separate, and that comes right after. But it's about letting them know what they are about to be a part of. And it's so vitally important because they're going to be a part of it. If they were just going to sit back and watch it, yeah, it's important, but sometimes it's fun to kind of throw a curveball. But you don't want someone coming into a session going 100 miles an hour, feeling zany as anything when you're trying to play a game about death and, something really slow and meaningful. So that's very important. Safety tools is sort of the next thing with game prep. And this is very different depending on how you're doing it. If you're playing a convention game, not only will the convention demand that you know a few, there are some that you should have that maybe they don't even necessarily want. And this is something that you have to sort of do at the table. If you're playing this with first-time friends, safety tools are a great way to start off the campaign, but then after you don't really need them, because for the most part, if you've been proper with your safety tools, they should be in effect throughout all the games. So there are two safety tools we typically use, and I use them for any game I'm not playing with my friends. I use lines and veils as my first and foremost, and then sometimes we'll use the X card. Did you want to talk about the X card maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. So the X card, I mean, if you're playing virtually, it doesn't have to be like a physical card, but the idea is that there's something on the table within easy reach of all players that anyone can tap at any time or indicate to show that they are feeling uncomfortable with something that's happening at the table, whether that's another character's interaction with their PC or something simple as using a name for a villain that they have negative association with that makes them really uncomfortable. Things like past traumas, PTSD, that can easily play into your game if you're not careful, if you're not using safety tools. So this allows the GM to note players' issues with content as it's happening at the table and gives you a signal so that you can step back out of the world, out of the game, and say, all right, someone's tapped the X card. We're going to rewind a few seconds and continue play, moving in a different direction from what we were just heading towards, right? You don't have to ask the person at the table why they were indicating with the X card. There doesn't have to be any sort of discussion about it at all. Basically, it's just hey, I'm going to eject out of this situation, but I don't want to leave the game.
Correct. Or eject us out of the situation.
Yeah,
probably an apt way to put
exactly. It's very, I guess, low. How do I put it?
Impact?
Yeah, low impact. Something that you can just use very simply in a group.
The other one that I use in almost every game that I don't play with people is lines and veils. Lines and veils is a really important tool for a number of reasons. Basically, I individually talk to, or if I'm in a convention setting, I'll slide everyone a blank piece of card to write down what is a hard line, i.e., these are things I don't want in the game. I mean, I don't need to give examples. There are many reasons people won't want things in the games. And then veils. Veils are things that are okay to be in our story, but that we want to kind of pan away from and not focus on. If torture is something that comes up, they want to ask the goblin where this happened or whatever, and someone's put that down as a veil, what I'll do is I'll kind of say, okay, so you tie the goblin to the chair. I can kind of see where this is going. What we'll say is that you guys get the information you need as you're walking out of the cave. And that's how a veil works. You're not giving it any sort of limelight, but you're allowing it to exist in the story of your world. So you can refer back to it later on. Be like, oh, remember when we got that information from the goblin? A line is something that doesn't happen. If torture was a line, it would just be like, are you you're tying the goblin to the chair? Okay, we're not going to go this way. Instead, he just tells you what you need to know far before you ever get the first rope around him. And that's a way, as Joe said, to honor a number of different things, past traumas and all that kind of stuff, PTSD, people who have dealt with terrible things in their lives. No one wants to have that exacerbated or reminded of in any way, shape, or form. And for those of you who kind of feel, wishy-washy on safety tools, grow up, because they're important. And you don't know why. It's so easy to enforce, to take an extra second and to let people know that they can feel safe here. It's a wonderful thing. There's no downside whatsoever. Now, there are a number of content warning safety tools that I understand tip scales a little bit. I recognize the desire to not want to reveal things that are exciting in your game, especially if you're doing a horror game. And that's what the tone is for. If you set up the tone and you say, in tonight's game, it's going to be very dark. We're going to deal with some death, perhaps even infanticide or something like that. If you're dealing with a murder mystery Call of Cthulhu feel, well, that's great. You've set the tone. You've let them know sort of what's going to be happening. People can say, this isn't for me. Thank you very much. I'm going to leave. Additionally, if their lines and veils conflict with a core piece of information that is required to make your story happen, and there's no way around it, you can also have that conversation. Look, I'm sorry, Joe. Unfortunately, one of your hard lines is pivotal to the plot line here. I don't have a way to change it. Are you okay if you sit out this session? Or maybe we can give your spot to someone else if it's a convention. If they get angry, well, then they should grow up too, because ultimately these are games you're playing in worlds, and you can't sit down to watch Gone Girl and be angry at David Fincher because there's a scene of someone cutting their throat. That's your decision to enter. It's the contract that you agree to, so long as you're aware of it.
Right.
So responsibility on both sides is how safety tools
The
work.
contract is explicit in this way, because if you're a good DM, and everyone is striving to be the best DM they can, you are trying to have a table of players that are feeling so immersed in the content that you are introducing to them that it might feel very troubling for people who are specifically have these specific issues. You just need to try to be sensitive to those people at your table.
Perfect.
And they should be sensitive to you too.
Yeah. So again, you've sat down, you've decided with your group whether you're playing rules as written or a little bit more rules light. If you're playing rules as written, you've now read the book cover to cover. You've discussed with your players whether you're going to be making characters on the fly or if you're going to be giving them pre-gens. Again, you've discussed that with them. Therefore, that's another wealth of knowledge you don't need to know. You've talked to them about the tone that you want to have with the game, whether you're running a pre-gen or a first-time original adventure. You've talked to them about safety tools, about what can and can't be in the game, and you've got their lines and veils and things like that. You have everything you need to prep an adventure. Beyond that, showing up on time, respecting their time, and having them respect your time is all that you really need to worry about in terms of game prep. Is there anything I forgot? I don't think so.
Did we kind of meld etiquette into game prep?
Nope, RPG etiquette's next. I kept pushing it off because that's what we're going to talk about in a second. But I just want to make sure, if you've done all of that, more or less, you have your game prepped. Some tips and tricks as the title of the show is, for game prep, just before we put a cap on this, one of the things I like to do before game prep is I usually like to make sure the mood is feeling awfully light. Make sure that everyone around the table kind of knows what they're in for. Not necessarily tone, but my style. I'll sort of preface them and be like, hey, my name is Harlan. Look, this is kind of going to be a light game. We're just going to have some fun. No worries about it. In my circle of influence, I always ask a few demands of the players. I always request that no one show up high or smoke drugs or cigarettes, preferably, while we're running a game. It's less common in public, but pretty often I can sit down with somebody and it's just less fun for me. No personal issues with it, just not my bag. And I think that's totally viable. I think that's fair for you to also request as the DM kind of what you're going through and what you want.
For me, my game prep is a little bit more about like highlighters and post-it notes. I want to make sure that I've got all my creature stat blocks all set up. I want to make sure my maps are all drawn out. And that's stuff I really enjoy doing before a game. So game prep for me is a lot about like making like index cards and highlighting passages in books and making sure that I have tables for names of NPCs, and I figured out what kind of food they're serving at the tavern. It's probably too much, but game prep can be as expansive or as brief as you like. It's your game.
One of the other things I do for game prep, just as a note, is I'll usually have at the top of my document sort of the tagline of what the game is, i.e. a group of adventurers go to a small town and find out, a banshee or whatever. And I'll have a table of names. I'll often have a table of names with a blank spot next to them, both male and female and sort of general. So that what I'll do is I'll have sort of a grid in Excel where I'll have all these names. I'll have like 10 male names, 10 female names, more or less. And I'll have a empty spot next to them. And what I'll do as I'm running the game, if I throw in a character, is I'll jot down who they are. So if we're playing the adventure and some random person they talk to, I just go, oh yeah, that's Phineas Feathertop. And then I write down, the merchant, so that I know going back. And that helps my notes and it helps me keep track of it. So there's a little tip or trick or whatever when you're doing game prep. Throw in a name table at the beginning with blank spots. And I have to stress, don't just put names. Put names with a second column of blank spots so you can jot in who that person is once you decide. Because I have done both. I have done just names and I've done just roles. And I'll tell you the amount of times I kick myself for not having a spot that I associate with it because I always forget who is what.
There's literally nothing worse than a party just glomming onto a specific NPC that you don't remember. And they're like, oh, I want to go back and talk to the shopkeeper. And you're like, the who?
Yeah.
I don't remember them.
No good.
Keep notes.
Perfect. So that's game prep. If you have any questions, shoot them in the comments on YouTube or Twitch and we'll answer them. But for now, we're going to move on to RPG etiquette. RPG etiquette, we've talked already a little bit about safety tools, which are vitally important, especially when you're playing for the first time. I want to stress that these aren't things you necessarily have to do if you're playing with the same people every day. We're not trying to force your hand to do something that is more or less unnecessary, so long as the first conversation has been had. A lot of people misunderstand that. They're like, oh, I don't understand why I have to do it. It's my best friend. We've been playing for years. It's not what we're saying, bruh. Figure it out. RPG etiquette. Let's talk a little bit about the respecting the DM. Respecting the player. And why don't you talk from the player standpoint, darling?
So the player respecting the DM, I mean, you want to definitely arrive at the game ready to play. So you want to have your pencil, your dice, your character sheet already leveled up, whatever is appropriate based on whatever game it is that you're playing. And you want to give the DM your respect. They probably spent a ton of time making index cards and maps for you. And you don't want to be on your phone the whole night. You don't want to, just get up from the table to go to the washroom without saying something. You know what I mean? Just treat the experience with a level of reverence appropriate for the event, right? It's a very cool thing that you get to do with your friends. So treat the DM and frankly all the other players at the table with some respect.
Absolutely.
What else, Harlan?
Well, as a player, I think one of the most important things you can do is understand the obligation that the DM expects from you, i.e., if this is a mystery heavy thing and they expect you to take notes, make sure that's clear. Be like, hey, DM, is this stuff I should be jotting down? And if the DM's like, yes, certain DMs, and we're using that as a general term, by the way, certain dungeon masters or game masters expect you to take notes and won't tell you information about things afterwards. Knowing your expectation is on the role of the player, because the DM has enough going on for them to sort of be like, oh, by the way, I want you to be doing this. So making notes when appropriate after, being like, hey, should I be paying attention to this is really important. You touched on it. Each table has their own set of rules for whether or not you can play with your phone or whatever. Generally, I think the rule of thumb is don't. I think it's pretty hard pressed to find a table where someone's like, yeah, go just be on your phone the whole time. Like, what do I care? That's fine. Don't worry about it. Not to say it doesn't exist, but especially if it's a first-time DM and you are either a first-time or a long-standing player, I think we all need to be pretty careful and cautious with first-time dungeon masters or game masters, because as we all know, and if you don't, you should, a first-time experience, whether from player or dungeon master, can ruin a great deal of this hobby. So we want to make any onboarding the best that it can be.
I would also say good RPG etiquette is trying to pay attention to how other people are role playing and trying to get into a game and interacting with them on their level. If you can tell that one of the other players at the table kind of wants to progress somewhere with their character, let's say you can tell that they want to have one of those, long walks in the moonlight where they get to think about what happened to them on the battlefield that day and, contact their deity or whatever, make a plea to their patron for more powers. And it seems like they really want to take like a moment to enjoy their characters role play. Don't steal the limelight with something stupid that you want. Like, give them a moment to, make space for the other people at the table and help build them up. And hopefully you can create a culture at your table where people will offer you that same opportunity, where if you want to get in hijinks with your character and you're looking for like your best friend to go out on the town with, someone is going to take you up on that and the two of you can build an encounter together that's going to be really satisfying. So
Absolutely.
kind of try to pick up where other people are putting down clues and go with them on sort of where they want to lead you.
Space is the best thing a player can do because, and we're going to pivot to the DM in a second, but the DM's role is really to fill that space with what they think makes the most sense. And we'll talk about that in a second. But before we move on from player, the other point of sort of giving someone space to do what they do is to not quarterback as well. Be mindful of how much screen time you're taking up. Even if you think your character is the most exciting, step back, give space, understand that your role in the game is only one piece of the pie, even if you think your character is the most exciting.
To that point, when you're in a combat and you think you know what another player should do with their turn, don't play their turn for them. Let them do that.
That's quarterbacking.
Yeah,
Unless they ask, obviously. Sometimes you're in a group where they're kind of like, I don't know, what should I do? And then obviously feel free to offer. But yeah, when it comes to etiquette, being a player means being present, leaving space for other players, and being actively involved with what's going on. You are part of something greater. So you want to sit down and sort of kind of help in a way. It's almost like being supportive at times. Now, from the DM standpoint, I think my number one tip or trick as a DM is similar to that of those who play poker. It's about reading the room. That is genuinely the best advice I can give. The better you are reading somebody, reading their wants, their desires, how they're feeling in the moment, the better you are at a DM. Because what you're essentially doing is you're recognizing where players might need more space, where they might need more screen time, where they might feel like they're being mistreated, by other players, by the NPCs, by maybe the decisions that you're making. And being a good read of players gives you the best way to let those characters shine. And examples being, if you're playing a game and these four characters are having a night at the bar, and one character excuses themselves, and the player is sort of anxiously looking for a scene, you might take that on the surface and be like, cool, this person excused themselves because they're no longer interested in what's happening. I'm just going to focus on this story. Well, reading the player and reading the room gives you the understanding that, oh, no, this player is looking for screen time right now. Let's also pivot to that. And in that role, being a director, sort of understanding where the screen time and the camera is swapping between the two scenes or multiple scenes is really important. So read the faces of the people in the room, understand how they're feeling, if they're being attacked too much, if they're feeling like this. It's not always about playing to those necessarily. Sometimes even if a character isn't liking the way they're being bombarded by attacks, well, it might be because of a decision they've made previous. But ultimately, understanding every player in the room gives you the best feeling of the flow of the combat, of the role playing, of the desires, of the wants, which gives you the best ability, puts you in the best spot to craft an interesting story.
100%.
What other DM etiquette?
I would say, again, kind of along the same lines as reading the room, you want to try to interpret not just what the characters are going to be doing and where they need help, but also the players. Some people may not feel comfortable asking specifically for what they want in the experience. Maybe someone is feeling pretty quiet that night. You can try to make space in your game for someone specifically to speak up by asking directed questions. Hey, how is your character feeling about this?
Exactly.
Make space for them to join the game if you feel like some of your players are kind of withholding.
And if you're reading the room properly, if you're not just thinking of the story, but you're looking at the characters or the players' faces and you're understanding, it's going to become really clear where you want to spend a little bit more limelight. Equally, if you're running a game at a convention and you're reading the room properly, and there are people that are at the table that aren't really respecting the game and people that are respecting the game, which is problems that we've encountered multiple times, there are many easy ways to separate them. It's not really etiquette specific, but we'll talk about it anyway. But like, I had a convention table once where there were three dude bros all together. It was their first time, which was very exciting, but they didn't really respect the tone that I had set out. It was a Call of Cthulhu game, and they were being very wacky and sort of all over the place, which is fine, honestly. This goes back to reading the room, which I'll go back to in a quick second. But they were really pushing the tempo in a different direction than the other players at the table, who were trying to take respect of the mission and all that kind of stuff. And that's fine. And I just separated them in terms of, cool, well, you guys were off, driving around. You missed the lead that pushed them to the next place. So where are you guys now? And it wasn't like punitive in the way that I was like, well, now you guys are in trouble. They were like, okay, we need to take this seriously if we want to be a part of it, because we need to think about this in a fair way. And this goes back to reading the room. And one of the most important parts of that, when it comes to reading the room, which is understanding the reaction from the players. And I talked about it a bit with combat and things like that. And this is something that we'll talk about in creating memorable NPCs. But sometimes you'll throw something at the players that you anticipate they're going to love. Or you'll throw something at the players that you'll anticipate they're going to hate. And sometimes that works against what you have anticipated. And a poor DM will try to fight against what they're perceiving in order to fulfill the DM's desires. I.e., let's say you introduce an NPC that you want the players to just love. You're, oh, well, this is the coolest character. He's going to be an orc, and he's going to be a badass, and he's going to have a big battle axe, and he's going to want to help them every step of the way. Well, sometimes you'll throw out a character like that, and the players just won't dig it. They'll either not trust him, or they'll laugh at him, or they just won't have fun with the character. The wrong call is to try to fight against that. If the feel of the group, or the feel of the players is tonally going one way, or if they're disagreeing on something, or if they're trying to sort of carve out a path, don't fight it. Say yes. As a DM, there's nothing more frustrating than trying to steer it. And if it really feels like it's going off the rails in a non-petulant way, feel free to end the session and be like, this was great. Let's start fresh next week. I can reset the tone. It's sort of like unplugging the router. You can kind of be like, okay, we're getting way too silly right now, and this is a serious point. Let's reset the router, and next week I can reset the tone so we're feeling a little bit more mellow for what's happening next. Absolutely. Or vice versa. You might be doing something that's really funny and no one's having it because it's just mellow, and that happens a lot in this COVID era, believe me. So sometimes it's easier to just take a break, stop the action, be like, hey, how's everyone doing? Let's pick up the energy. Let's have some fun. Should we call it here? I don't want to push you guys. And I think all first-time GMs or DMs that have done it, that first year, I should say, of DMing, if you're doing it or not, have sort of been in that moment where you look around at everybody and see them all tired or exhausted. I think it's one of those rites of passage. You know what I mean? I think no matter who you are, it's like probably game 8 or like anywhere between like 8 and 30 in your
wear
arsenal.
Out your table, or else they wear you out.
Yeah, you're like sitting in your office or whatever. You're sitting in your bedroom, or you're sitting around your kitchen table or whatever, and you're like mid-explaining, you're like mid-dungeon crawl, and you're like, yeah, the blade looks, and you look up and everyone's just kind of like, and you've been playing already for 3 hours, and you're like, okay, you know what? Let's just call it there, guys. We're all losing a little bit. And that's all about reading the room and reading the table.
And I think one of the last things that I want to touch on in this topic is just about holding yourself to a standard that you can't possibly accomplish.
Not everyone's Matt Mercer.
No, man. And like there are so many, we're very lucky that there's so much actual play media out there to consume, people on Twitch and people with podcasts and live streams, and it's really amazing. And you see some huge talent out there, people who are just killer, and all these players who got all the accents, and it's okay to do a good job and have fun with your friends and not feel like you're creating, an 8-book series of fantasy novels with your game. You can just have some fun at your table, and hopefully people pick up what you put down, and you get to have some laughs with your friends, and maybe you kill a PC one time and it's the best. It's
so much easier doing little, like starting small, you know what I mean? And it doesn't mean small has to be uninteresting, because when we talk about developing a campaign, which we might actually say for another episode because we're winding towards the hour, but there are many tips and tricks and ideas that we can give you and that you can read about and understand to kind of give you that edge, And there are many different ways to start too, but we'll save that. So RPG etiquette in general, as a player, respect the table, give space for others, and understand the DM's job here is sort of more, I don't want to say important, but put more effort into it than yours to show up and have fun.
Collaborate with each other.
Collaborate. As a DM, read the room, understand when the tone shifts, understand how they're feeling about characters, and try to get to the heart of your players' wants and desires by reading their reactions, i.e. how they're doing it.
I like that.
And say yes. What's that?
Well phrased. Get to the heart of your players' wants and desires.
Yeah. Did I say that?
Yeah, you did.
Also, say yes. It's like improv generally, and that will be another topic at one point, the art of improv, but we'll deal with that when it comes up. I think we'll end today on the last topic because I think it's not going to be as long. But yeah, so we talked about game prep, how to get there, how to feel sort of part of it. We talked about RPG etiquette, which sort of bridges, and hopefully some of that stuff was educational and maybe gave you a few ideas. But now we're going to cut more into the meat of it. And going forward with tips and tricks, we are going to be talking a little bit more of the meat, i.e. stuff that we've used that could be something you utilize. And the first thing we want to talk about is creating memorable NPCs. What are NPCs? They are non-player characters. These are characters that flesh out your world. And believe me, many pre-gens have them suggested for you. And there's nothing wrong with that. But, we are, one of my favorite sayings, we are the latest it has ever been in the timeline of the world. This is the latest year. This is the last year it's ever been.
You're full of them today.
I know. And that is to say that I think doesn't matter who you're sitting down at the table with, we have now entered into a world of tropes. which sort of gives you a few strong benefits as an NPC. Playing with tropes is one of the most fun things that you can do. And we're also in the era of tropes being so prevalent that you can also have a straight up trope and not feel like you are going outside and still feel like you're going outside the norm. You know what I mean? It's like 70s to 1998 in the realm of Dungeons and Dragons, orcs were bad. And then 1998 to 2020, the sort of fun was to switch it and orcs were good. Well, we're kind of rounding it again where orcs could be bad again. And what I mean by that is that tropes, the essence of them are turning on their heads, and now turning them back is equal in itself a unique idea. So when you're creating an NPC, the first sort of rule of thumb is to try to pick real people. There are many different ways you can facilitate the running of NPCs. And don't get me wrong, NPCs can absolutely be caricatures of real people if you're looking for a specific type of game. You know, sometimes it's fun to have a one-note Pokemon-esque character that just repeats its phrase. But what we're talking about is memorable NPCs. And while those are memorable characters, I would call those more set dressing. You know what I mean? If you walk up to a character who only says dink dink and he's purple and he has a tall hat and there's fuzz at the top and he does cartwheels every time he talks, yeah, they might walk away being like, oh, dink dink, that was such a funny thing. But that was a set piece. There wasn't any heart there. There wasn't anything that the character had struggled through. And the best NPCs are the ones that you have affection for when you're crafting them.
Mm-hmm. Yep. You have to create characters, or we would suggest that you create NPCs that have their own wants and desires, that have something going on in their lives besides just standing around waiting for the characters to interact with them, right? You want to have people populate your game in a realistic way. Just to add more complexity and dynamism to the gameplay that your characters can enjoy.
Yep. Dynamism. That's a good word.
Thank you.
So when you're looking at creating NPCs, again, it's difficult because I feel like all my mindsets go towards Dungeons and Dragons, but to me, I won't think that. It depends first and foremost of where this NPC is falling in with your story. Are they in the first town? Are they in the mansion? Are they in the barn shoveling, stuff like that? You know, understand the NPC's goal within the story first, and then branch out from that. It makes no sense to create a sprawling backstory for a character that feels shoehorned into the goal that you want them to do. You know, if the stable boy is the one that's meant to reveal that he is the son of the king 2 towns over, that he doesn't know, you know, the bastard child or something, you know, that's fine because, you know, you've decided that's where he's being introduced. But don't start crafting a story without understanding that aspect. Because if you're like, cool, well, this guy traveled on the high seas, I think he's a pirate. Yeah, he spent a lot of time. Oh, I see it. He's got salt crusted hair and, you know, a sunburn, and he's kind of got this big shaggy beard, and he's 60. You're like, well, hold on. How's that the young bastard son of the king? You know, you got too excited thinking about what possibilities there were before you got to what you need. So work backwards from their purpose in the story. And let's not forget, NPCs, in the way that we view them in role-playing games, are to serve the story. You don't create an NPC that is just background fodder. That becomes a set piece. That's a dink-dink with bright blue hair or whatever I said.
Tall hat.
Well, that's right. Because ultimately, you think that, oh, here's a great, when playing Monopoly, do you think the banker is an evil capitalist? You must be right. Yes, absolutely. Here's an actual question. Don't go too deep in NPC backstories. You usually get quickly killed by the murder hober players. Exactly. Which actually goes back to RPG etiquette.
I was going to say, this circles back around. We're getting cyclical because if you care too much about the NPC and you put too much effort into it, the law of D&D is that character will either be killed by your players, or the players will be like, cool, thank you so much for this potion. Bye. And they're not going to ask any questions or get involved. So be judicious about where you're placing all of your effort, right?
Yeah.
Think about this character that you're going to be introducing, who they are, what they want, their mannerisms, what they mean to the players in the story, and then move on with your life.
Absolutely. And going back to reading the room, roll with how your players perceive the NPCs you add to the game. Don't force them to like or interact with the character.
Oh, this is the best. Because if they get suspicious about a character, then you can make that character suspicious.
Yeah.
Feel free to like mold them to the story based on how your player characters are interacting with them.
Absolutely. You know, there are many different mindsets for being a game master and writing a story. And one of them, which is absolutely valid, is that these are the pieces that exist in the world, and this is how they function, full stop. I.e., this is a wizard. He grew up in Waterdeep. His name is Jack Page. No, I'm just kidding. This is a wizard who grew up in this small town. He came up here, and he will always be good, or he will always be bad, and nothing can change. And let's say he is always good, and the players interact with him, and they think he's bad. And they really think he's bad. Well, it doesn't matter, because he's good. And that's how he is, full stop. And that is a way that you can be a game master. And that is fine.
It's not very fun, though.
Well, to me, the issue is it's not a better story. It doesn't have the guarantee to be a better. It could be, but when you're writing a story or when you're talking about a story, you know, when Stephen King gets to the end of his novel, do you think he goes, oh, but you know what? Lizzie would make a better villain. Oh, and it all lines up. Oh, no, but she's a good guy. Never mind. No, he'd be like, oh, that's such a better ending. I'll just write that.
Yeah, and don't be too precious about your preconceived notions of the story.
And people think that you can't change it. And this goes back to the first thing I said when we started. And the thing I've said to GMs time and time again, it's a fucking story. And it's your story. If you want this character to feel a certain way, write it. If you want the player to encounter a giant, you just write it. You do what you want, because all it comes down to in the end is a story. And if you can tell a better story by flipping the allegiance of something, oh no, will the players feel cheated? Well, guess what? It's a game. That's the fun of it. So long as you're not undercutting the rule, the contractual rule that you have when you sit down at the table by playing with the mechanics of the game, so long as you're not cracking dice or changing an outcome of something that you know would ruin their experience of the game, then everything else is open, because that is what you are telling. And at the end of the day, if the player sits down at the table and they are in for telling a good story, then they are going to be happy about that, because it will make a more interesting story.
Absolutely.
And it's difficult. We are so precious with our PCs and NPCs alike, and being able to be fluid with them and roll with them is important. Oh, Justin's here. Look.
Hey, Justin.
That's a great tip. I always lean to molding my NPCs and story elements depending on what the players are thinking. It just makes me feel more interactive with me. Absolutely. And also, it's just more fucking fun.
If your wizard has a ring of immunity against fire and has been so pumped about this ring for the last 10 episodes and nothing has happened, put a fire-breathing dragon in your story, for goodness sake, and allow him to feel special. Create circumstances where that awesomeness can happen.
And this is going to tie really nicely into the next time we do a tips and tricks episode, which we're going to start off with developing a campaign. And just to briefly talk about that, one of the strongest things that I believe in, and I have for a long time, is planting seeds. And planting seeds is a term that I use, and I'm sure many others use, when you're crafting a role-playing story, where you're dropping names and characters and rings and items and moments that seemingly are uninterested. And this is what you do when you need something later on. This is exactly it. Like, let's say you give a mundane ring to a character. Okay,
a halfling,
perfect.
let's say.
A halfling, let's say. Well, guess what? When you're done with the Hobbit, you're like, you know what? That ring that made him invisible. What if it's not just an invisible ring, but it's the one ring to rule them all? And if you think that was a dumb idea, then you're stupid, because that's exactly what happened. I promise you that's what happened, because it meant nothing to him when he did it.
Nothing.
No, I think he probably did it the first time. But anyway, regardless, seed planting is very, very important, and I highly recommend that we do it when we talk about it next week or next episode. Might not be next episode, but we'll talk about it soon. Anyway, that was it. We got game prep, RPG etiquette, and creating memorable NPCs. Admittedly, we spent the least time in the last one. Maybe we'll touch a little bit more
Circle
on
back
that.
around.
There are more thoughts on it, so we'll share this at the beginning of the next episode. Hopefully you enjoyed. Please like the video and share it if you like all that kind of stuff. Again, we're going to be back in 2 weeks with another Sigil Spotlight, probably interviewing another wonderful person that works at Sigil or works with Sigil. That was it from us. Hope you have, what is it, a Friday? Hope you have a wonderful weekend. And as always, we will see you around the table. Good night, everyone.
Good night.